Okay, it's Kristen Forster here. Unfortunately, what I'm having to do is re-record this session because, for some strange reason, the recording that we made the other night when I did this live somehow got corrupted and lost. And I know that certain people want to kind of do this as a small group and they're working right the way through. So I just thought the simple thing to do, there weren't a huge number of slides, so I'm just going to re-record a kind of a description of each slide, just a little bit of talking into it. It will be a bit shorter than the usual sessions. But hopefully that will be useful and kind of fills up the whole story of Moses. So we're on to the second part of week 2 of the exploration we're doing from a kind of archaeological historical view of the Exodus history. So we left it with Moses being born, being given a name that means something in both Egyptian and in Hebrew, and now we're here at that point where Moses is going to grow up as a Prince of Egypt. I think, as I mentioned, Prince of Egypt is one of my kids' favourite films, and they kind of watch it whenever they come home. They're all grown up now, but they still love the film, of course, and then they get annoyed with me for saying what fantasy it is. But anyway. Moses did grow up as a Prince of Egypt, just in a different era under a different Pharaoh, as we've seen. And there are some things we can know about his childhood and of him as a young man. In fact, there are, surprisingly, there's some history in both Artapanus, who we've already thought about, and in Josephus. And actually, we find that it is actually, again, the history is matched by archaeology. But let's tell the story. So Moses' education, as we saw right at the beginning, where Pharaoh's daughter has come out. She's unmarried at this point. She's found the child in the river. She's effectively brought it under her protection, and at that stage, Miriam is the sister in mind here, has gone and offered the services of Moses, his natural-born mother, as a wet nurse. And the impression we get is that he's with the family for some period. So Moses is kind of hands-on early education, as he kind of grows from toddlerhood into boyhood, is actually probably provided in the context of a Hebrew family. So I think he will grow up very conscious of his background. It wouldn't be a kind of a shock and a surprise to him. And now that kind of comes out later in the narratives. There seems to be more of a relationship between him, Miriam, and Aaron than would be if he just suddenly discovered them out of the blue and had to take on faith that they were his brother and sister. I think the idea is much more that he develops in that kind of context. But he is brought back as a young child. We've talked about this last time. And we read, but as he grows older, as he now comes into the family of Pharaoh, and then his mother marries, and he becomes the adopted heir of Sobekhotep IV. He would have then kind of moved into an education system that was put together for young men, for Egyptian royalty. So he would have been taught to read. They weren't uneducated kings who would kind of educated viziers. The viziers were probably smarter than they were, but they were taught to read and they were taught to write. They were taught history. It's possible he would be taken on kind of cultural trading trips. So he perhaps would have gone down to Midian, which is going to come into the story. At the end of this session, beginning of next week, where we find him in Midian. It's very likely that as a child he would be taken to experience some of these things, from the Nile Delta right the way down there and so on. He may even have had things like the laws of Hammurabi may have come through Egypt at this stage. All of these kind of things are going on at this period, and Moses would have been receiving a very good education. But crucially in this mix, he would also have been exposed to the arts of warfare, how to lead troops, how to organise and manage for battle, because that was expected of the king. They should be able to lead those campaigns, and so from a young age he's been trained in those things. And so we actually are told, both by Artapanus and by Josephus, that as a young man he actually leads the Egyptian army against a massive Cushite. The Cushites came from Ethiopia. Cushite invasion into the south of Egypt. And so that as a kind of an idea, or as a kind of a story, was one of those things that was kind of pretty much ignored, because particularly Artapanus has his kind of history seems to be grossly exaggerated. He wants to make the Jews the heroes every single time and so on. So no one really took it seriously until about just over 10 years ago, when actually physical evidence was discovered of a massive Cushite invasion. And what's really interesting is it actually hits, that invasion happens during the Second Intermediate Period. So it's 2003, a 22-line text was excavated. It's not that it wasn't seen before. It's just nobody who could translate it had actually properly looked at it. So it was there in tombs at Al-Kab, and it was translated, and it discovered that there was a massive push into Egypt during that second intermediate period. Now, it's a slightly separate thing, but there's also a stela in Karnak that also refers to a campaign against Cush that happens during the reign of Sobekhotep IV, which is, as we've thought, is Moses' stepfather. So during the reign of Moses' stepfather, he has a campaign against Cush. Now, if you're kind of quick on these things, you'll notice an invasion by Cush and a campaign against them aren't necessarily the same thing. But they could be, because actually you can, as often happens in these situations, an invasion happens, they are repelled, and in the repelling of them, then the person that they've attacked, who's had the kind of, if you like, the détente has now been broken, they then push themselves back in and make an invasion to kind of claim their rights in the foreign territory. And that kind of a picture actually fits the story that we're told by Josephus and Artapanus. So I think I've got on the slides. So here we go. Just got some of the texts from Antiquities. So Moses came upon the Ethiopians before they expected him, and he deprived their hopes that they had of success against the Egyptians. So Moses appears with the Egyptian army quicker than they expect. There's a kind of sudden rush, and there's a rout that goes on. And as he goes on, Josephus tells us about how in the fray where Moses pushes back into Ethiopia, one of the princesses of Ethiopia, of the Cushites, notices him and thinks he's a nice looking lad and comes up with a solution, and they kind of sue for peace with the offer of marriage. And so we read in Josephus, so when Moses had cut off the Ethiopians, he gave thanks to God and consummated the marriage and led the Ethiopians back to their own land. So this is the incursion in. Sorry, this is the incursion in bit. So in this campaign, according to Josephus and according to Artapanus, Moses has actually he's actually created an alliance by marriage. So he has a Cushite wife, he has an Ethiopian wife, which it kind of comes as a bit of a shock. And you think, well, it's not the Bible, it's history, but actually it is the Bible, because actually we meet this Cushite wife in Numbers 12 verses 1. So it's the situation now, they're in the desert, and Miriam and Aaron are having a problem with Moses, and of course they're rebuked by the Lord for it. But the problem comes down to Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses because of the Cushite woman whom he had married, for he had married a Cushite woman. So we don't have a big amount of this story in the Bible, but it's there. This lady is part of the mix, and creates part of the tensions in the leadership of Israel as they're leaving Egypt. It's just kind of interesting to see, because it's not an unreasonable situation. Moses doesn't effectively flee until he is a kind of well-established adult, and actually as a young prince we'd expect him to have had some sort of liaison or marriage happening. And actually we can see in its kind of context some very kind of real tensions that actually make sense of some of the biblical texts as we kind of work our way through it. So what we're told by Artapanus is that actually Moses' military and his administrative skills are making him increasingly popular with ordinary Egyptians, by which he means the ethnically Egyptians. So suddenly, what we now have, and he goes on and explains that Kenephrez, which is the part of the royal name of Sobekhotep IV, as we saw last time, he's becoming jealous of Moses and he wants to have him removed. So what we now have is we have Moses who knows his history, is ethnically with a population that certainly up in the Nile Delta is pretty much matching the Egyptians man for man. And even though they've been oppressed and so on, and they are an oppressed people, and therefore there'll be levels of bitterness. So he comes from that context, but he's slightly compromised because he's, of course, grown up with privilege in the house of Pharaoh. But now he has made an alliance to sue for peace with a very powerful enemy, because actually Cush was actually a very well established kingdom down in the south, and it was a fruitful region, and so they're at this stage they increasingly were discovering they were a powerful force to be reckoned with. So we have a bitter and large and significant minority in country. We have just outside country, we have an enemy that would love to do something into Egypt, and the man who's supposed to be the defender, the Pharaoh's adopted heir, the oldest of his 4 sons, as we saw, has now made an alliance with the south, and suddenly I think you can understand why it is that Kenephrez, or Sobekhotep IV, starts to get nervous, as Artapanus says it, which kind of gives us a little bit of context for the words that, of course, that we read in Exodus. So it happened in those days when Moses had grown up. He went out to his brothers and looked at their burdens. And he saw an Egyptian striking a Hebrew, one of his brothers, and he looked this way and that. And when he saw there was no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. And I've left a kind of a ... because, of course, the next day when he sees two Hebrews arguing and he tries to stop them, they say, well, who made you a leader or judge over us? And you get a kind of a tension here, because Moses doesn't really belong anywhere. He doesn't belong to the Hebrews. He doesn't belong to the Egyptians, because now his father-in-law doesn't like him. And he doesn't belong really to to the Ethiopians, even though he's got a Cushite wife. And I think you get some of this in next week, as we're looking at Moses. He's in Midian. He has his first son via Zipporah, and he calls him Gershom, which could either mean he's a stranger here or he's a stranger there. Interestingly, a bit like the name Moses, he's a man who's been, is he a son saved out of the water, or is he the one that pulls and saves people out of the water? Oops, that's my phone. I'm just going to have to. So my apologies. I had to go and answer the door. We had someone kind of coming to deliver something. So anyway, back to where we were. I was just saying. So yes, he calls his first son Gershom, which a bit in a similar sort of way can mean two things. So the tension is kind of prophetic. He's either a stranger here or a stranger there. Because obviously in one sense you could see it as Moses saying, I'm a stranger here in Midian, because one day he's going to end up in the promised land. That's where his home's going to be. Or he could be a reflection on his past, because he was a stranger in the land of Egypt, where he wasn't really Egyptian, but neither was he really Hebrew, as we saw him here being rejected by his own people. He wasn't really Ethiopian, even though he has an Ethiopian wife. And so there's a kind of a sense in which he's arrived, and perhaps he's sort of saying, well, now I found a home because I've left Egypt. But equally, the name could mean he's a stranger here, because one day Moses is going to uproot from Midian. He's going to go back to Egypt, lead the people into the land of Canaan. So you get all of those kind of things going on. But anyway, so he doesn't quite fit in with his own people. And so when Pharaoh heard what he'd done, it gives him, of course, the excuse. He's been feeling insecure about Moses, and when he hears, he seeks to kill Moses. So Moses fled from the face of Pharaoh and lived in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well. So you can see on the map, you see where Midian is, on the kind of the east side of the Gulf of Akbar. And you can see the lower Egypt and the top. You see that route across, which is 250 or so miles down to the top of Midian. But actually there's a series of kind of trading posts. It's very, very ancient, because they follow the oases that kind of cut across from northern Egypt. It's probably that route that he probably would have taken as a young man in his educational system. And so he is kind of aware it's somewhere perhaps where he's already been. And each of those oases, you see, they're guarded by a kind of nomadic tribe, and you come and you pay a fee. This has been going on for thousands of years. You pay a fee, you can water your animals, you can find food there as a kind of rest stops and so on. And so you use the actual kind of those oasis stops as you kind of cut across. There's apparently 9 of them that have been there for thousands of years, because they don't move, because they are fixed by, if you like, the geography of the water and where the oases kind of rise up. So we will start next week, which is, of course, the story of Moses' encounter with God, there in the beyond the deserts from Midian. So we'll think about that a little bit then. But we've taken Moses through his childhood into adulthood. We found some stories, found they fit with the archaeology, and now we found Moses over in Midian. So sorry it's all been a bit brief, but anyway, I hope you've got something out of it anyway. I'll see you next time, and hopefully the video recording will work first time. Good. Okay, I'm going to put stop now.